Hi everyone, this is chapter 46 lecture, Chemical Signals in Animals, which will deal with the endocrine system. So we've talked about the fast response in the body, which is the nervous system. The endocrine system is how we respond to things more slowly. So you're going to see that the action potential is very, very quick, whereas the signals that take place with hormones and other secondary messengers are going to take a lot longer and have more far-reaching effects. So in response to external stimuli, things out in the environment, or things inside the body, we talked about how this works with the nervous system, right? You send out action potentials to elicit a response. The other way in which this takes place in animals is through the endocrine system. So it releases hormones. And like I mentioned earlier, these are going to be transmitted through more long-term responses. So what is a hormone? A hormone is a chemical signal that circulates through the body fluids and affects large distances. So essentially a hormone is going to be secreted from some organ, from some gland, endocrine gland, let's say the pituitary gland, which is located, on the brain. And the hormone is then going to move through the body, bloodstream, to ultimately act on some effector far away. Okay, so the hormone is the signaling molecule that is going to bind to a cell and then elicit a response in that cell. Specifically, organs that are going to secrete hormones into the bloodstream are called endocrine glands. And depending upon the animal, the organs and the tissues that make up the endocrine system are going to be pretty different. So in insects, neurons manufacture and secrete hormones, and we see those being important signaling molecules in things like molting, so regulating when it's time to molt, undergo a metamorphosis, and other processes. Salmon have an unusual gland called, I think it's called, I want to say the Skene's gland, but I don't think that's correct. I got to look it up now because it's going to bother me, but I know that their gland regulates calcium ion concentration, and I believe that gland is involved with when the salmon go from areas of fresh water to salt water. They have to kind of balance that, and it's going to bother me now what the name of that gland is. In the human endocrine system, we have incredible diversity among our different endocrine glands. So we've got the anterior pituitary, the posterior pituitary that are controlled by the hypothalamus, right? Plus we've got all kinds of other organs that serve both endocrine functions and other functions, right, which we'll see like the pancreas. Cells and many other organs and tissues are going to, like I said, secrete endocrine hormones, even if that's not their primary job. On the flip side, totally different than endocrine glands are exocrine glands. So an endocrine gland is going to deliver hormones within the body to the bloodstream. An exocrine gland is like a sweat gland or an oil gland that's going to deliver, sweat and oil out of the body, right? So you can remember that as endo means within, and like an endoscopy, if you've ever gotten one of those, or an exo kind of sounds like exit, leaving, something like that. So here's just an overview of all of those glands that we talked about in humans, or that I kind of started to mention, and kind of what they do. This isn't something that I'm going to hold you to memorize, obviously, but there may be a question or two where you'll have to just look this information up. So be familiar with it. Take a look at where the various endocrine glands are in the body. So the hypothalamus is actually the master gland, and what the hypothalamus does is it sends out these releasing hormones. Okay, and then these releasing hormones are then going to stimulate the pituitary gland to then release their hormones. So these releasing hormones then lead to the pituitary gland sending out hormones from there. Okay. In addition to what's going on here with the hypothalamus and the pituitary gland, we've also got the pineal gland, and the pineal gland produces the melatonin, the hormone melatonin, which keeps your circadian rhythm in check and signals when to go to sleep. Okay, here's all the hormones of the anterior pituitary gland, and these here, they're listed with the hypothalamus, but these are actually posterior pituitary gland hormones. Insulin and glucagon are produced by the pancreas. The pancreas has both an endocrine and an exocrine, an endocrine and a digestive function. This is the endocrine function, the insulin-glucagon feedback, which we talked about, I think, earlier. The ovaries and the testes produce the sex hormones, respectively, in males and females, females and males. Kidney produces something called erythropoietin. Okay. Superior to the kidney, you've got the adrenal glands that produce epinephrine, cortisol, aldosterone, that are very important hormones in our stress response. Okay, major hormones here that are controlling every metabolic aspect of your body: the thyroid gland and the parathyroid gland. Thyroid gland, butterfly-shaped gland, kind of gland like in your throat, requires iodine in order to produce these T4 and T3 hormones that are, like I said, very important in growth and metabolism. Parathyroid, PTH, is going to be involved in your body's response to calcium concentration, so it's going to increase blood calcium concentration by promoting the breakdown of bone. And then on the flip side, calcitonin does the opposite there. Okay, so this figure is showing you kind of how the different hormones are ultimately traced back to the hypothalamus. So the hypothalamus in the brain is the real master of all of your hormones. So the hypothalamus is going to, like I said, produce these regulatory hormones, right? These releasing hormones. So these hormones will then trigger the response of the anterior pituitary gland here to produce the hormones that will then enter the blood. So the releasing hormones signal the anterior pituitary gland to produce these various hormones. Now, you don't need to know what all of these do for this course. Just kind of recognize the overall structure here of how it goes from hypothalamus to anterior pituitary, and then the anterior pituitary gland will act on other parts of the body and sometimes even release hormones from there. So, for example, the thyroid stimulating hormone, which is produced from the anterior pituitary, is going to act on the thyroid gland to get it to produce thyroid hormones. Okay. Growth hormone releasing hormone is released from the hypothalamus to release growth hormone, which acts on the liver. And from the liver, hormones are released to then act on bone, muscle, and other tissues, somatomedins, to induce growth. Okay, so it's a pathway here. On the posterior pituitary gland, what we've got is just basically an extension of the brain, and it's directly stimulated by the brain to release hormones without this releasing hormone first, like on the anterior pituitary. So, and the hormones that are released by the posterior pituitary are ADH and oxytocin, which is oxytocin is involved in childbirth and other things related to that, so uterine muscle, mammary glands, things like that. ADH is antidiuretic hormone, which acts on the kidneys to increase water reabsorption, and we talked about that when we did urinary system and way back when. Well, really not that long ago. I think it was just last week. It feels like forever ago, because I kind of record these lectures a week in advance, so it feels like longer to me. Okay, so a single hormone can exert a variety of effects. So a major example of that are the thyroid hormones, because they are really just controlling everything related to your body's breakdown of foods for energy and things like that, which ultimately lead to growth and various other factors. So it's all connected. T3 and T4 are the thyroid hormones, and they stimulate metabolism. And if you stimulate your metabolism, your body is going to increase its rate of production of various, of growth and things like that, and that affects other parts of the body as well. Several different hormones may affect the same aspect of physiology. So, for example, insulin, glucagon, epinephrine are all going to influence glucose levels in the blood. So all of these are going to have an influence, and glucose is going to ultimately influence many, many, many things in the body. But these three hormones, which come from different places, all affect glucose levels. Hormones coordinate the activities of cells in 3 different arenas, so growth, development, reproduction. Okay, so once the pituitary gland signals growth hormone and all the hormones associated with puberty, you're going to see major changes to get the body ready for reproduction. Response to environmental challenges, so that's things that happen out in the environment. So your hormones do play a role in regulating your heart rate and sweating, and in addition to that being a sympathetic response, there's also hormonal factors, and that goes to number 3, maintenance of homeostasis and keeping at a balanced level. So I mentioned this a little bit already, but there's a portal system that exists between the hypothalamus and the anterior pituitary. So the array of hormone systems are based on this interaction, okay, from the hypothalamus, which is going to send those releasing hormones, to the pituitary, to ultimately getting to the different areas of the body. Okay. The posterior and the anterior are each influenced by different populations of neurons in the hypothalamus. So like I said, there is no releasing hormones for the posterior pituitary. Specifically, the neurons there are called neurosecretory cells, and that term, if you look at it, neuro having to do with the nervous system, secretory secreting something. So we're talking about the interaction here between the nervous system, which is ultimately signaling the secretion of hormones. Okay, so here's a look at what's happening with the posterior pituitary, which is directly connected to the hypothalamus, and you can see from there, through this portal system, ADH and oxytocin are directly produced. They target different organs, and then there's ultimately a response that takes place from them. Okay, with the anterior pituitary, we've got, again, this portal system here from the hypothalamus. Releasing hormones then go to the anterior pituitary, and our hormones do the same thing where they act on a target and then a response is elicited. So the difference here being that in the anterior pituitary, you've got the releasing hormones that then enter the portal system, whereas the hypothalamus is just directly connected to the posterior. There's no middleman there. So like I said, the posterior pituitary extension of the hypothalamus, it's hypothalamic tissue. The neurosecretory cells that project from the hypothalamus produce ADH, oxytocin. From there, they're released to the bloodstream. The job of ADH, antidiuretic hormone, is to aid in the reabsorption of water by the kidneys. So in that distal convoluted tubule, if ADH is present, it's going to reabsorb water. Now, we talked about things that can inhibit ADH, right? Remember, drinking alcohol inhibits ADH. So if you remember, okay, I know this has to do with, I know alcohol, I have to go to the bathroom all the time. So if you think about it, right, you're drinking alcohol, you're inhibiting ADH, you're not going to get that reabsorption of water, whereas what are going to go, it's going to leave the body, you're going to have to pee all the time. Okay. Oxytocin, like I said, is involved in the female characteristics of childbirth, so inducing labor, and it runs on a positive feedback during labor, and you'll see that it's continuously released until the baby is born via positive feedback. And also it triggers milk release along with prolactin, which is another hormone, an anterior pituitary hormone. The anterior pituitary is connected via the portal system, tiny blood vessels. Okay. In response, the anterior pituitary alters the secretion of hormones that enter the general bloodstream and act on target tissues and glands. Okay, so you have to have those releasing hormones, then the hormones are released from the anterior pituitary, then they act on their target tissues or other glands. So some examples of the hormones that are released by the anterior pituitary, and again, this was on a previous slide, ACTH, FSH, LH, GH, prolactin, TSH. These are all examples of hormones that are produced by the anterior pituitary. Okay, so thyroid stimulating hormone, adrenocorticotrophic hormone is ACTH, growth hormone, GH, luteinizing hormone, and follicle stimulating hormone are involved in the reproductive system. Okay, so this is going to be where I'm going to end the first part of this lecture, and we'll pick up with the next one in the next lecture.